And there it is, the official version.
There it is.
Thanks very much, Wayne, for that introduction, but also thanks for the work that not just you, but the other total of 8 organisations put into producing this very important contribution to the national debate about the way forward for transport, in particular the way forward for our cities. I want to begin by firstly acknowledging the traditional owners of country and pay my respect to the elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge Warren Truss, the Shadow Minister, Lee Rhiannon, the Greens political party spokesperson on transport, Mike Murdoch, the Secretary of my department, and if you'll excuse a little bit of indulgence, I want to acknowledge Dorte Eklund, who before recently, and still is, I think you're still on the payroll, yep, is currently the head of the Major Cities Unit, established as one of the first things we did in office early in 2008. Dorte has played a critical role in terms of politicians are often our jobs to be at the front, but we need good public servants giving us good and sound advice. We sought out Dorte, who had an outstanding record if you look at what's occurred in Western Australia under a former government there in terms of access to public transport, engagement with the sustainability of our cities, and we sought her out to head the Major Cities Unit. She's done an outstanding job. The problem is that she's done such a good job she's been poached by the ACT government, and I want to put on record my thanks for, I think, playing a very important role in changing the balance, one that acknowledges that 75% of Australians live in our major cities. 80% of our GDP comes from our major cities. As much as our minerals and our farms are critical for the national economy, the truth is, in terms of if you look at where the growth and economic activity comes from and where Australians live, we don't all live on farms. And the national government, if it is truly to represent the nation, must be engaged in our cities. And the Major Cities Unit has been very important. It's hard getting an organisation going from scratch, and Dorte's done an outstanding job, and I want to acknowledge that here tonight. Thank you. Just a year ago, I stood at this venue and announced the Moving Australia 2030 Task Force. I wasn't very well that night, some of you might remember. So it is indeed a real pleasure to be back here tonight to launch the results of that task force. 8 leading organisations put their collective brains to work. Not just a triumph of effort, but also a triumph of common sense. All of your organisations seek the same thing: the best possible transport system to carry us and our freight around this nation, and a transport system that supports and builds a more productive, sustainable and livable, as well as active, Australia. Last year I also spoke at BIC's annual conference. In between climbing in and out of a bus that actually drove around the stage, I also launched the national discussion paper on walking, riding and access to public transport. Submissions to that report closed a few weeks ago, and I'll turn to it shortly. But let's begin tonight with the results of your hard work, this report that I've just officially received. The Bus Industry Confederation has long been a consistent and unified voice for boosting the momentum of the Australian economy through an improved transport system. I congratulate you, on your leadership in forming and hosting the Moving Australia 2030 Task Force. I acknowledge the others that made up the group: ALGA, the Australasian Railway Association, the Cycling Promotion Fund, the Heart Foundation, Planning Institute of Australia, the TTF, and the International Association of Public Transport. Many of the task force members are here tonight, and I thank all of you for your considered, valuable work in putting together this important contribution to national public policy. Your work nicely complements the government's own national urban policy, the first time ever that a national government in Australia has put together a policy framework for the future on urban policy. Our cities, our future, and our push to raise productivity, ease congestion, reduce carbon emissions and improve the health and well-being of every Australian. Your report sets 4 tangible targets. These are that by 2030, 1, public transport, walking and cycling will account for 30% or more of all passenger trips in our capital cities. An ambitious target, not an overly ambitious one though, one that is achievable and I think can be exceeded. Secondly, the carbon emissions from the passenger road transport sector be at least 50% below the 2000 levels. Thirdly, that fuel consumed by the road transport sector be 30% less than currently forecasted. And finally, 4, that there be a variety of transport modes convenient and accessible to all Australians. The important thing about this report, I think, is that it's easy to either say it's too hard, so we'll just concentrate on regional roads, or it's easy to come up with platitudes that say we'll eliminate the need for investment in roads, we'll eliminate the need for modes of transport that contribute to emissions, we'll just support public transport, full stop. This is a really practical report. It's a practical report that will encourage governments at all levels, and indeed the community that needs to be engaged in this as well, to argue, campaign and actually attain the goals that are in this report. And I think that is a very important and valuable contribution to the public debate, and I congratulate you for it. You strongly argue that the key to reducing congestion is better and more accessible public transport and providing people with the opportunity to safely walk and cycle. At present, Australia has one of the highest private car mode shares in the world, with almost 90% of trips undertaken by car. That can't be turned around overnight. With 99.9% of our cars run on fossil fuels, it is clear that even a modest modal shift to public transport and bicycles will be one of the most influential determinants on how well we reduce our soaring greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. A full bus can take 40 cars off the road. A full passenger train takes 500 cars off the road. Your report points out that even a 10% shift from cars to buses would reduce our yearly greenhouse gas emissions by some 400,000 tonnes. You also look at freight transport. Freight coming and going from our ports, airports and markets. The big trucks and light commercial vehicles delivering goods around the urban area. These are the lifeblood of our economy. Put very simply, if the supply chain breaks, the shelves are empty. But for the most part, the community, while wanting those shelves well stocked, are not so happy to share the highways with prime movers or their local streets with lots of buses, heavy vehicles and delivery vans. We can continue to move freight off the road and onto rail, but changing community perceptions and protecting freight corridors and precincts are big challenges that must be met if we are to achieve a seamless economy and address productivity issues. You recommend that on top of the federal government's national land freight strategy that's been developed by Infrastructure Australia, the respective state and territory governments follow their own complementary strategies. I'm aware of states such as New South Wales that are already well down this path. This certainly makes sense as we pursue a national seamless economy. I'm delighted that the Moving People team will be presenting to the National Transport and Planning CEOs at their meeting this Friday. And I expect that this will flow through to discussions when I sit down with my colleagues at the May meeting of the Standing Council on Transport and Infrastructure. Thank you once again for the work that has gone into this impressive document, Moving People 2030. I think it is essential reading, and not just reading, but the basis for action of all those who are committed to and responsible for providing sustainable transport solutions for this nation. Let me now turn to the key findings emerging from submissions to the government's report, Walking, Riding and Access to Public Transport. It's hardly surprising that many of the submissions closely echo the key challenges that have been identified by the task force. Since launching their report at your October conference, some 185 submissions have flowed in from across the country, from local councils, community organisations, industry peak bodies including BIC, and state and territory agencies. Almost half of the submissions have come from private individuals, including one petition from 2,000 signatures. There are a great deal of community engagement on these issues. Some of the key themes have come up consistently. For example, the word that recurs again and again is safety, the call for walking and cycle paths that are separated from traffic so that people of all ages and abilities can use them to get around their neighbourhood. There is also a call for governments to fill in the many missing links in our existing cycle networks and to provide safer routes to schools, bus stops and rail stations. But perhaps the strongest emerging theme is that transport leaders across all levels of government recognise that walking, cycling and public transport are mainstream forms of transport that should be provided for in the normal course of infrastructure programming. For example, when we build a bridge, we shouldn't consider it only as a carriageway for car traffic. We should also ensure that it caters for walkers and cyclists. When we help fund a commuter railway, we should be confident that stations are connected to a network of walking and cycling routes. This idea, generally referred to as positive provision, is hardly new. Our most famous piece, perhaps, of transport infrastructure in the nation, excuse me being a bit Sydney-centric, is the Harbour Bridge. It has catered for walkers, cyclists and public transport users for more than 8 decades. What's more, it wasn't built to cater for the existing car use that was needed in the 1930s. It was a great example of infrastructure vision, looking forward, not years, but decades into the future, which has served this nation extremely well. Positive provision is a policy that has been adopted by some states and territories. We've ensured at the national level that as we consider future infrastructure funding priorities under the next tranche of our nation-building program, the provision of safe, active travel options are built into the design. This will mean that federally funded urban transport infrastructure projects must consider whether provision has been made for appropriate cycling and walking paths. This is so they're available for all users, whether on foot, 2 wheels or 4. One of the many advantages of including these opportunities at the outset is avoiding the heavy cost of retrofitting down the track. The submissions are available on the departmental website, so you can see for yourself the strength of support for the active travel and public transport agenda. The department's now considering policy options, and I expect initiatives will be announced over the coming months. As you know, I'm pretty keen on delivering results backed by solid evidence. Public transport is an area that up to now has been neglected in terms of good, solid research into present and future usage and its place within our transport systems. Both your Moving Australia 2030 report and our own Walking, Riding and Access to Public Transport report help fill the gaps. The jigsaw is a step closer to completion with the release tonight of modelling and long-term forecasting into public transport use in our capital cities by the Bureau of Infrastructure and Transport and Regional Economics. Its report reveals a turnaround in public transport use, with public transport share of total passenger travel growing since 2005 for the first time in 30 years. While the rapid growth experienced in the late 2000s is likely to slow, demand is forecast by BITRA to increase by about 1/3 over the next 2 decades to 2030. This has obvious implications for infrastructure provision and the public transport story. It's an interesting story, and I encourage you to visit BITRA's website and download the report. The results help provide an understanding of the forces shaping public transport demand in our cities. This in turn will inform policy decisions around public transport infrastructure planning, urban transport reform, urban design, congestion and road safety. Can I conclude by saying this? If there is a figure that I am extremely proud of all the figures I roll out about our infrastructure provision around the country, it is this. Since 2007, the current government has committed more funding at the federal level to urban public transport than all governments combined for the previous 107 years. That has made a difference. Some state governments are hard to give money to for urban public transport. It sits there, such as on the Parramatta to Epping rail link. It sits there and is still available for state governments to take up the commitments that have been made. Our federal system does provide, occasionally, difficulties in getting this agenda through. But we also have made a huge difference in terms of freight and getting cars and heavy vehicles off the road in order because of our support for the freight system. The Southern Sydney Freight Line opened in Sydney just over a month ago. It means that the curfew that operated around Sydney and Port Botany, whereby in the morning peaks and the afternoon peaks, rail freight couldn't operate because passenger rail quite rightly got the priorities. What that investment and that opening means is a huge difference to the way that Sydney can operate. Together with the Northern Sydney Freight Line, now under construction, separating passenger from rail freight, it makes an enormous difference. The Moorebank Intermodal project will take 3,300 heavy vehicles off Sydney's roads every single day, making a huge difference once again. Again, making a difference for freight, but also making a difference in terms of public transport. I think it's very clear that we have changed much of the debate, and the fact that this report exists, frankly, is a change of the debate that previously existed at the national level, national government level, with regard to urban public transport, active transport, cycling, walking, all of the different modes of transport, apart from the much-loved motor car here in Australia. That's not to denigrate the role that it will continue to play in a nation such as ours. It is to say, though, that the national government can play an important role, and that role is important not just in terms of transport, but it's important in terms of improving our national productivity. It's also important in terms of the difference that it can make to sustainability of our cities and making a difference to the whole of government approach that is required to deal with the challenge of reducing our carbon pollution. And that's a challenge not just for governments, it's a challenge for the community as well. And it's a challenge because we all have a responsibility to future generations to leave the country of which we have, particularly those of us in public office, where we have a particular responsibility to leave the country better as a result of our contribution to public life. So with that, we need to invest to make sure that people can get around our cities and between our cities and around our nation easier in a way that's more productive than it has been in the past. But it also means, due to the nature of our cities and the challenge of urban congestion, that we need to deal with public transport. Markets will play a role in that. Market-based solutions show that where public transport has been provided, whether it be buses or rail or light rail, people will take up that option. Too often, I think public office holders have hidden behind the easy option, which is just to build a road and to allow individuals to make the case. The truth is that public transport has been taken up, and in terms of the patronage has usually far exceeded, whether it be on every form of public transport, has far exceeded the projections which are there, which is more than can be said of some other forms of transport in terms of patronage projections. That's why this report, looking forward to 2030, is so important, and that's why I think the fact that the proponents of this report haven't been utopian in their vision moving forward. They've been practical. It's a challenge to those of us in public life to meet it, and I, for one, intend to take up that challenge. Thank you very much.